They took my brother, not a job, not honor, but his life. I stood at the funeral holding his kid's cold hands and whispered one word to myself: vengeance. I'm not after justice anymore. I'm becoming the judge, the jury, and the executioner in their story. They told us it was an accident. That line, accident, tasted like bleach and dust. A machine failure, a missed safety check, a contractor who forgot. The company statement was polished: condolences, full cooperation, promises of internal review. The CEO looked re-grieved on camera and folded his hands the right way. The reporters wrote what they were given. I watched the footage at home with my brother's jacket still hanging on the chair. He had been the kind of man who fixed broken things for a living. He showed up when others left. He trusted the system. He trusted the people who signed the checks. He trusted them until a bolt failed and took him. At the funeral, the CEO sent flowers and a senior manager signed the guest book. I watched them sign their names, neat, tidy, detached, and I felt something inside me harden the way iron does in winter. I wanted to stand up, walk to that man, and ask him the only question that mattered. Did you sleep last night knowing my brother was dead because of your corner cutting? But I didn't. There's a power to silence. There's a power to the long game. If you throw a stone in a pond, you might make a splash. If you sit and wait, you can build a dam. The first weeks were wasted in a fog of grief and paperwork. The family needed me. The kids needed their mother. There were calls with lawyers and investigators who said things like probable cause and administrative negligence. It was all legalese that sounded like a slow escape hatch for the guilty. And then, like a map unfolding in my head, the word pattern appeared. The same supplier used for parts in 3 different plants. The same subcontractor cut from safety audits. The same memo about cost optimization signed 6 months before the accident. My brother's death had a signature, and it matched a pattern of corners cut to keep the quarterly numbers pretty. Grief gave me focus. Rage gave me patience. I stopped sleeping the way people who've been wrong stop sleeping. Eyes open, mind active, a list growing in the dark. I printed PDFs, annotated emails, highlighted invoices. If grief was a fire, documentation was the chainmail I put on to walk through it. The first thing I did was not dramatic. I did not call a talk show or hire a lawyer to shout into a camera. I learned to read balance sheets. I learned procurement code names. I found that companies hide the same things in different folders. They give the truth the dullest label so no one thinks to look. I needed allies who knew the things I didn't, a whistleblower who'd seen the memos, a former safety inspector who was tired of being ignored, a forensic accountant who knew how to trace money that was supposed to be invisible. They were not hard to find. People who watch corruption up close tend to leave marks on their records. Faint, bitter, but readable if you know how to read them. We met in rooms with bad coffee and good Wi-Fi. They brought me the small things. Unauthorized change orders, delayed maintenance tickets, an internal chat where a manager joked about saving money, while an operator begged for a new bolt in writing. The things weren't sexy. They were paperwork. But paper becomes truth if you hold it up to light. We started a file, a simple folder labeled for a do not share. In it, we put everything that smelled like the company's negligence. We photographed broken equipment, we mapped timelines, we traced the chain of approvals. Every fact, every signature, every invoice was a small stone that would later build a wall. Then I made a choice. There are 2 ways to burn a company, with headlines or with currency. Headlines can make a man look bad for a week. Currency corrodes from inside. I wanted corrosion. So I built a business where truth paid. Not because truth should be profitable, but because money opens doors and money buys time. I founded a small compliance consulting firm, a humble name and a sharper mission. We offered what people needed most: transparency that the big firms didn't want to provide, audits that weren't made to hide failures but to fix them. It was, in many ways, theater. We posed as a vendor, one among many, pitching best practice optimization. We won small contracts because we were cheap and attentive. We fixed problems the big firm ignored and kept a ledger of fixes, dates, and who approved them. The clients loved us because we actually solved their problems. While we worked on the surface, the other team worked under it. We cultivated sources: a procurement clerk with a conscience, a subcontractor who'd been paid off and then cut, an engineer who'd been silenced. They sent us redacted invoices, audio files of meetings, emails with the timestamps that contradicted the public story. We were careful. Every leak went through channels. Every reluctant witness was protected. I learned the language of legal safety. I learned to build a narrative that could stand in court and in headlines. And then we did the thing I had promised myself I would do at my brother's grave. We put the pieces where they would hurt them most. We started with a quiet move. We published a small investigation on a local industry blog. Names, dates, paper evidence, and a through line that showed the negligence was not an anomaly, it was policy. The article was sober, surgical. It read like a report, not a hit piece. The response was predictably loud in the rooms where prophets argued with principals. The company issued a denial. The CEO sent a calm statement. The board convened an independent review. That's when they started to sweat. When you control the narrative, you can delay an investigation. When the narrative fractures into documented failures, the press follows the paper trail. Investors started asking questions. Clients were nervous. The first client we'd saved quietly let their contract slip away from the big firm and came to us publicly. There was a day I will never forget. An internal memo leaked to us by someone on the inside. It was a list of cost reduction initiatives, with line items that read like a litany of deliberate neglect. Deferred maintenance schedules, outsourced inspections, alternate suppliers with suspicious ownership. The memo had signatures. Real signatures. I sat at my kitchen table with that memo and knew that the phase had shifted. This was no longer about exposing a failure, it was about dismantling how they had chosen profit over lives. We assembled the dossier, the memos, the invoices, the eyewitness accounts, and passed it to a crowded table. An investigative journalist known for refusing payola, a lawyer with a record of winning against corporate giants, and a regulator who used to be my brother's mentor and who, when he saw the files, sat back and said, "This is bigger than we thought." We did not scream it into the world. We let the dossier land where it would be handled with care and teeth. The lawyer filed requests. The journalist wrote a feature that could not be ignored. The regulator opened an official probe. Newsrooms that usually took corporate spin called for comment. Share prices twitched. Board members began to call each other in the middle of the night. The machine that had once swallowed my brother was now shivering. And yet, the most satisfying move for me was not the press. It was the phone call I made to the procurement lead who had sat across from me at the first hearing, the man who'd signed the cost optimization memo. I told him plainly, "We can do this quietly or we can do this publicly. Your choice." His voice trembled. He asked for time. I gave him a deadline. He did not meet it. When the public report dropped, the angle was brutal. Evidence-backed negligence, conflicts of interest, and executive decisions that prioritized margins over maintenance. The company's stock plummeted. Regulators demanded hearings. Clients demanded refunds. The CEO who once signed my guest book suddenly found himself answering questions under bright lights, and his smooth answer slid on the truth like oil on glass. I sat at my brother's empty chair and watched the television. The newsroom interviewed a union rep holding up my evidence, the same man who used to wave little memos at me and say, "We can't fight the machine." A week later, several executives were placed on leave. An independent safety review began. The company's board reshuffled under investor pressure. It was not the violent vengeance I felt at the grave. It was surgical. It was public. It was precise. And as I watched their empire crack where I had known it was weakest, I thought of my brother and I whispered, "This is for you." But the work was not done. Exposing the rot opens windows. The real question is what you build after the clean. I had more plans. More moves. The story was far from over. The first act closed with the company reeling and the world watching. My brother's name had been dragged back into the light. People were angry. People were hurt. People were ready to change. And me? I sat with that feeling that had guided me from the beginning, that cold, quiet, focused rage, and I started to sketch the next phase. The dam I wanted to finish would not just punish them. It would prevent another family from burying a brother. To be continued. When the headlines broke, people called me a hero. I wasn't one. Heroes forgive. I don't. The company's empire was shaking, but not broken. They had lawyers, investors, and enough money to bury the truth under a mountain of paperwork. I knew the war had just begun. They thought I was done after the first expose, that I'd take my win and disappear. But I didn't want their apology. I wanted their collapse. Weeks after the scandal, their stock crashed. Executives resigned voluntarily. The CEO went silent. But behind that silence, I could feel them regrouping, moving money, erasing traces, protecting what was left. That's when I made my next move. I wasn't just going to destroy their company. I was going to own it. It started small. I used the consulting firm I'd built, the same one that helped expose them, to buy out their desperate partners. Companies that once relied on them for supply chains were now bleeding contracts. I offered them lifelines, cheaper deals, clean audits, no scandals. One by one they signed with me. Each deal I closed wasn't just profit, it was leverage. I wasn't just building a business. I was building an army. But to win the war, I needed access. Inside access. So I bought stock, quietly in small pieces through proxies and shell firms. Every share was a bullet, every vote a weapon. They didn't even notice the name that appeared in their shareholder meetings. A new investor, small but persistent. They were too busy cleaning the mess I'd made to realize that the man rebuilding their image was the same man who'd burned it. Then one day I got an email. From him. The CEO. Cold, polite, and curious. I've been following your company's growth. Impressive work. I'd like to discuss potential collaboration. I laughed when I read it. The man who had sent flowers to my brother's funeral now wanted a meeting. I replied with one word. Sure. The meeting was set in their new headquarters. Smaller, less glamorous, but still proud. I wore the same watch my brother used to wear, cracked face, leather faded from years of work. A reminder. He greeted me with a politician's smile, perfect, practiced, poisonous. Mr. Allen, he said, extending his hand. Pleasure to meet you in person. I looked at that hand and thought of my brother's, scarred, calloused, real. I didn't shake it. Let's talk business, I said. He talked numbers, market share, recovery strategies. He used words like synergy, mutual interest, reputation repair. I watched him spin his lies, and for the first time I realized something. He wasn't a villain. He was worse, a coward wrapped in a suit. He didn't care that people had died. He cared that investors had left. When he finished his pitch, I leaned forward and said quietly, "Tell me, how do you sleep knowing people died because of your greed?" He froze. His mask cracked for a second. "I don't know what you mean," he stammered. "Yes, you do," I said. And then I placed a single photo on the table, my brother smiling in his work uniform. The air left the room. He looked at the photo, then at me, and for the first time in years I saw fear in his eyes. Real human fear. "You're," he started, but I cut him off. "The brother of the man you killed. And the owner of 18% of your company." He went pale. I stood up, buttoned my jacket, and said, "You wanted collaboration. You're about to get it. From now on, I make the rules." I left him sitting there, speechless, surrounded by everything he built, and everything I was about to take. That was the turning point. From that day forward, I wasn't fighting from outside the walls. I was inside. I replaced their suppliers with mine. I redirected contracts. Every time they tried to rise, I pulled another thread. Bit by bit, the empire that took my brother began to devour itself. I didn't gloat. I didn't celebrate. I just watched. Because revenge isn't about rage, it's about patience. The press called it a hostile takeover. They had no idea how right they were. Months passed. Their board fractured. The CEO tried to rally support, but his allies were now my clients. His finance chief resigned. His investors bailed. The company started selling assets to stay alive. And then came the final blow. I called an emergency shareholder meeting, my right as a major investor. The CEO sat across from me, sweating through his expensive suit, pretending to be composed. I looked him dead in the eyes and said, "For negligence, for corruption, for blood on your hands, I move to remove you from this board. Effective immediately." The vote was quick. Unanimous. He stood up, speechless, stripped of power. It was over. As he walked past me, he stopped and whispered, "You'll regret this." I turned to him and said softly, "I already did. The day you killed my brother." He left the building for the last time. And I sat in his chair, not with triumph but with something colder. A strange silence. Because when you finally destroy the monster you've been chasing, you start to wonder what's left of you. That night, I went back to my brother's grave. I placed a small metal plaque beside his name. Read, "Justice delivered." The wind was quiet. The city lights glowed in the distance. And for the first time in years I felt peace, not because I'd won, but because the world finally knew what he was worth. But deep inside, I also knew this wasn't the end. Revenge ends the pain, but it doesn't heal the scars. And those were just beginning to show. Sitting in his chair felt wrong at first. It was leather worn by other men's decisions, a throne built on quarterly reports and boardroom applause. For years it had been a symbol of everything I hated. Now it was mine, and the weight of it pressed in ways no victory ever had. People expected fireworks. They wanted a coronation, a parade, a speech that would drown out the past. Instead, I called a meeting. The conference room that once smelled of ego and stale coffee smelled different with me in the middle, colder, more deliberate. I didn't announce sweeping firings or gloating layoffs. I put a stack of documents on the table, safety audits, maintenance logs, timelines tied to my brother's accident. I put names beside neglected orders, signatures beside deferred repairs. We change, I said. Or we close. There was protest. There were lawyers who whispered about liability and investors who clenched teeth about margins. There were the board members who had shrugged when a man died. They were still there with their carefully tailored excuses. That made my next move simpler. I signed an agreement: immediate safety restructuring, independent oversight, a public fund for victims' families, and, most importantly, a full, transparent compliance program with whistleblower protection. No PR bandages, no internal reviews that disappear. External auditors, public dashboards, real consequences for those who cut corners. When the regulators came, they didn't come for me. They came for the proof I handed them. Some executives were charged with misdemeanors, others with criminal negligence. The courts did what courts do: measured, slow, messy, but they also named responsibility. Under oath, some men who once smiled quietly at memorial dinners found their palms sweating and their words stuttering. Sitting in the gallery as testimony unfolded felt strange. I didn't shout exoneration or parade revenge. I watched, silent, while people who'd hidden behind balance sheets answered to the truth. My brother's name was called. My kids were in the crowd, older now, with eyes that still remembered their father's laugh. When the judge read portions of the deposition, a cold clarity passed over me, a clarity that made the ache shift from raw to bearable. Power changes you in small increments. The first time I used my authority to protect someone, it felt right. The first time I used my authority to crush someone petty, it felt hollow. There's a moment in all of it, the hinge where you decide who you will be. I had sold myself a promise at his grave, to make something that would prevent this kind of death from happening again. That promise had to outlast the urge to simply break the men who broke us. So I built safeguards. We changed supplier contracts so bidding was transparent. We created a living database of safety checks, accessible to clients and regulators alike. We created an emergency fund for workers injured on the job with no fine print. We set up channels for anonymous reports and gave them teeth. Anyone who blew the whistle got immediate protection and a clear path to impartial review. I hired the very safety inspector who had tried to warn my brother, the one the company had ignored, and made him head of compliance. Not everyone liked it. Some investors grumbled about margins. Competitors snickered that we'd become soft. But the customers, the real people who used our services, who trusted their livelihoods to our systems, they noticed. Contracts that had once been paper exercises turned into commitments with human faces attached. There were darker days. The former CEO didn't go gently into the night. He hired lawyers, he made threats, he leaked documents that painted me as the vengeful outsider. Old board members tried to rally a counterplot. A late-night smear campaign tried to make the public forget the facts we'd surfaced. I learned how dirty the fight could get: calls in the night, anonymous accusations, people looking for pieces of my life to break. Once, a courier left a package at my building. A tiny model bolt, rusted, with a note that said, "You missed one." It was childish, but it was meant to watch me. I kept the bolt. I put it in a drawer with the plaque from my brother's grave. 2 reminders, one of what started it, the other of why it had to end differently. The hardest thing was watching the men who'd built that small culture of cruelty go down and feel something other than triumph. For a time I wondered if that made me weak. Maybe it did. Maybe it made me human. When the ex-CEO was sentenced to community service and a fine, less than I'd expected, more than he deserved, I felt neither celebration nor closure. I felt fatigue. The death still hung in the air like a cold fog between buildings. But then came the letter from a woman whose husband had worked in a different plant. He'd lost his job in the chaos of the exposés and had been rehired under the new safety program. Her letter said, "He came home for dinner. We have time to breathe now." That single line was a small hot light in all the gray. That line reminded me why I'd begun. I also had to rebuild myself. For a long time, I'd measured myself against the scale of the men who'd crushed my brother. I had let their language, their priorities define my reaction. Slowly, I learned new measures: the number of people rehired with dignity, the lives saved because maintenance didn't get postponed, the kids who went to sleep without worrying their father wouldn't come back. I tried therapy. I spoke to priests and poets. I rebuilt small rituals: a morning coffee where I no longer read shareholder updates first, a weekly visit to the children's school where I sat in folding chairs and learned math homework again. I found that reclamation isn't always a public headline. Sometimes it's learning to laugh at a joke you would have missed before. Of course, some scars never fade. The sound of a wrench still makes me shiver. The smell of oil will always be mixed with memory. But the anger that once burned like a furnace now serves a different purpose. It keeps me honest. It keeps me moving when complacency creeps in. Years later, the company looked different. The revenue charts normalized. The stock rose on sustainable gains. Most importantly, the corporate culture had changed. New managers said safety first, like it was a mantra, not a box to tick. The families of the victims attended an annual memorial that included scholarships and a fund dedicated to worker safety research. My brother's name was on that plaque, but his story had made a tiny dent in the world's indifference. One night, after a long day of meetings, I went back to the cemetery. It had snowed lightly. I brushed the snow off the plaque and traced my brother's name with my glove. I talked to him like a man talks to a map that guided him. I told him the truth, that I had become what I promised not to be, in order to stop others from becoming what they were. I said sorry for the things I'd done in the middle act, the silence I'd kept, the threats I'd launched, and I spoke with honesty about the line I'd had to find between being avenger and guardian. When I stood up, the air was sharper. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt settled. The world isn't tidy. Wrong things still happen. Men still cut corners. But the system we'd built made it harder for those corners to go unseen. That, in its imperfect way, was a victory. I didn't tell anyone this, but sometimes at night I take my brother's old wrench out of the drawer and hold it. It's heavy, familiar, and useless now, a relic of the life he lived, not the one I wielded. I put it back and I sleep. The war had an endgame I'd never expected. Not annihilation, not an unending hunger for payback, but a kind of repair. I wanted to break them. Instead, I found a way to reassemble something that people could live inside. If you ask me now whether I regret any of it, I'll say this: I don't regret the fight. I regret the parts of myself I had to burn to win it. But wounds teach. They teach what is worth defending and what is worth changing. In the quiet after the storm, I learned that revenge can be the beginning of responsibility, and responsibility can be the only way to make a life mean more than a headline. I walked away from that chair the same way I'd walked away from my brother's funeral. Slowly, with hands in my pockets, listening to the city breathe. The plaque at the plant still had his name. The plaque in my drawer, the rusted bolt, stayed for a while, then I buried it under a sapling we planted for the workers. It was my small, private closure. And as the new morning lit the skyline, I finally heard something I hadn't in years: the sound of a life that keeps going.